Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's show, we're going to be talking about Bill C-18, otherwise known as the Online News Act, and what it means for Canadians and for media outlets. And to do that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Peter Menzies, a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a prolific writer on this topic. So I'm very pleased to have you joining me today, Peter.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be on this show.
Peter, so maybe we just start with the basics for a lot of Canadians who may not be familiar with it. What is the main purpose of the Online News Act?
The main purpose of the Online News Act was originally for struggling newspapers to access funding from big online performers such as Facebook and Google. Since then, profitable broadcasters and the CBC have bellied up to the bar too. So now it's a sort of broad shift of money from successful online platforms to unsuccessful legacy media platforms.
Okay. So I guess I'll start maybe with the obvious question. You've been a big critic of the idea of forcing these other platforms to subsidize newspapers. But what do you say to those who argue that this legislation would really just force the sort of Googles and Facebooks of the world to pay for something that they themselves are making money off of, that they're sharing, for example, links to a newspaper, and they're getting ad revenue off this? What's wrong with making them share some of that money with the newspapers themselves?
Well, I think the big thing on the part of the media companies looking for it is there's two things. One is the imbalance of power in negotiations, and that's fair enough. They have a good point there. So if they wanted to be able to negotiate collectively with these big companies and make sure that there wasn't a perversion of market power so that they could get good commercial deals, that's one thing. I don't think anybody really has a problem with that. The other one, though, is this sort of fantasy that the Facebook and Google are making a lot of money on their content. They keep saying it as if it's true, but they've never really made the case to show how that occurs. And they also seem to always, just overlook the fact that Facebook has provided, in the Facebook example, it has provided them a free platform through which they can access billions of eyeballs, right? That has a value, according to Facebook, of about $220 million a year. Having worked in the newspaper business at one time myself, your distribution costs are considerable, right? If you have a free place to distribute your product, you are doing well as well. So, if there's an agreement of equal commercial value, then people should make it. If there isn't, then they should not.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying the newspapers want to focus on the value that the platforms are deriving, but they don't want to talk about the value that they get from using the platform. And I guess the obvious point that people often raise is that if these platforms are what they're doing is so harmful to newspapers, why are newspapers themselves actively sharing their content on these platforms?
Yeah, it's not like Facebook is going out and grabbing their content off the web and stuffing it onto Facebook and then making money with it, right? They have implied, some of the proponents and lobbyists in favor of C-18, that that's the case, but that's absolute nonsense. If that was taking place, there'd be court action going on. The companies willingly place their product on there, right, as part of the agreement. And yes, Facebook has cornered the market on advertising. That's because people like to go there. But according to Facebook, only about 3% of their business is actually news transactions, and also according to them, most of their users aren't interested in news. News generally means politics, and that means fighting, and people don't like fighting.
That's very interesting. And we've heard that Facebook's threatened to take news off their platform altogether. Do you have any insight into whether you think they might actually do that?
Oh, I don't think they have any choice. I think because of the way Bill C-18 is set up, that says they have to pay per link, and the news companies can control the links. that maybe they could shell out a little bit of money in Canada, but that has global implications for a global company like
Right.
Facebook, which means they really don't have any practical choice but to get out of the news business.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the Online News Act with Peter Menzies, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Peter, we're talking about Facebook just before the break, and in your view, that they might actually pull news content off their platform in Canada because they have to, because it would set a terrible precedent. Some people have argued that this is sort of Facebook threatening and bullying. But in your view, you're arguing it's actually in their commercial interest to get news off their own platform.
Oh yeah, no, I mean if you can avoid, an expenditure that makes sense to you as a commercial operator, you should. I actually think it would be good. I mean, people will still look for news, and it would be good for the news companies to just have people going directly to their websites and that sort of stuff. It would put Facebook in a less dominant position in terms of being, the clearinghouse for everything. I actually think there'd be an upside to it. And from, like I said, from Facebook's point of view, it's a very small part of their business, and their
Right.
shareholders would not be pleased if they were to just start giving away money, which is basically what it is. If they can find commercial agreements that make sense to both parties, then
Mhm.
fine. That's good. And in fact, and they have agreements right now with just about every major media company in the country.
Very interesting. I wanted to raise one of the other points that's often made when we're talking about what governments need to do or how they should help struggling media. I think the basic point is usually something like, well, flourishing media is a critical pillar in democracy. We can't let media outlets die. So if the Online News Act is not the solution to that, what should the government be doing instead?
Well, I mean, I've just made the argument that they should be having a proper national news media strategy, right? That goes across the board. And there's many complicating factors. They've got some policies over here that are causing unintended consequences over there, which in turn cause unintended consequences over here. So, I mean, in order to get to where you want to be, you kind of have to have a roadmap, and they don't have that right now. I mean, the argument that keeps getting made, it was originally made largely from Post Media and Torstar, that that they are the defenders of democracy. Unfortunately, if you're in the government's pocket, I don't think you can be a very good defender of democracy. And even if you think you can be, you are not going to be trusted to be so by the public at large. So, I mean, there's media in all kinds of countries. I was watching yesterday, Iranian reporters interviewing U.S. soccer coaches and that sort of stuff. Um, Media has existed and does exist in North Korea and China and Russia. Uh, what really matters to democracy is freedom of speech and an independent free press.
I want to return to the reputational and trust issues in a minute, but I wanted to ask first about what about the concern that almost all outlets will die? I mean, the newspapers seem to suggest if they don't get support, they'll disappear. Canadians won't have the ability to inform themselves, even though they want to. What do you say to that?
I think that's a pretty bold thing to say, that you are that impressed with yourself that you think democracy will fail if your particular business fails. 209 new online news companies have started up in Canada in the last few years. Yes, 500 or so traditional weekly newspapers and that sort of thing have died. It's a period of great transition, and it's really difficult. And some people have been successful at making the transition, and some people will fail. Funding the people who are failing will not get us to where we need to go. What we need to do is make sure that we are supporting an innovative entrepreneurial environment in which people coming up with new ideas and new platforms can succeed. I mean, let's be honest, it's all about online now, right? Like print had a good run, 600 years, but it's over.
Right, right. And it's interesting that you flag the new outlets because that's something we never hear the other side of. We tend to hear about the outlets that are struggling, the ones that are at risk of going under, but we don't hear nearly as much about the entrepreneurship and these startups, which are having some success. And so I think that's an important part of that conversation. We've got a lot more to talk about on this topic. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back with Peter Menzies in a few minutes. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the Online News Act with Peter Menzies, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Peter, I mentioned off the top, you've written a lot on this subject. And we talked in the last segment a little bit about the declining trust in media, and you noting that having media is one thing, but if media is not seen to be independent, it's really not serving its function as a sort of guardian of democracy. So it's no secret that trust in media has been declining in recent years. In your view, first of all, why has that been happening? And then secondly, what will the impact of the Online News Act be on this troubling phenomenon?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. I mean, putting what happens with the Online News Act is that these commercial agreements, so-called commercial agreements, that are supposed to be forced by the bill are overseen by the CRTC, which must approve them. And the money must be spent in the newsroom, which likely will mean that the CRTC will be encouraging people to, spend them in certain ways that the CRTC likes news to be shaped, as it has with a lot of its other regulated projects. So you dedicate so much time and space or resources to this underserved group or that underserved group, etc. It also puts them in charge of overseeing, and by putting them in charge of overseeing commercial agreements, those aren't really commercial agreements anymore. It's a form of subsidy. And when it gets viewed by the public at large, it just plants another little seed of doubt in people's minds regarding the independence of the news organizations and their willingness to hold a government upon whose good graces they depend accountable. And I can't remember.
In terms of the first question was about why. I mean, it's so generally accepted phenomenon that there's less and less trust in the media. That's not just here in Canada, but sort of around the Western world. Okay. Why has that been happening?
I think a lack of discipline. I mean, a lack of balanced journalism. There is a lot of good journalism. Let's be fair. There is a lot of good journalism being done by a lot of good journalists. But we all get, and one bad apple, is the rule in terms of this. If you go on social media, you will see reporters all over the place, not commentators, not the Andrew Coynes and Susan Delacourts who are paid for their opinions and should freely distribute them. But you see people who are supposed to be news reporters constantly expressing their opinions as if they're of value to us, but it undermines people's trust in them, right? I mean, it was long been a standard in journalism that if you are a news reporter, you avoid expressing your personal opinion publicly. You are expected to behave in an objective fashion. Nobody doubts that you have your own personal point of view, but everybody would expect that you would keep that to yourself or just within a private group. Social media really undermining themselves. It's actually just appalling for an old hack like me to watch this sort of suicide.
It's interesting when you put it that way because the analogy I would think of as a lawyer is that imagine if judges were doing this. Imagine if you had judges on social media sort of sharing their opinions on all sorts of things. They've always had opinions, but they didn't publicly sort of spread them around. That would really cast doubt on their objectivity. And it sounds like, in your view, that's exactly what's happened with journalists. They've always had personal views, but they're airing them in a way now so constantly, so perpetually everywhere that it's hard for people to trust them as being objective.
Yeah, and like to make my point, like the Globe and Mail reporters, for instance, appear to conduct themselves very professionally. They will post their stories, respond only if there's a clarification in fact needed, and just walk away from it. Not engage in fights with people and that sort of stuff. Others from other news agencies will, I mean, they just throw opinions out there, and then they start complaining about journalism is under attack, right? Because people are upset by their opinions and their apparent lack of fairness and objectivity in their reporting, and they complain that journalism is under attack. The government must do something to defend us. Well, it's actually under attack by you for being bad at journalism to begin with. Not that there's any excuse for some of the people's conduct and threatening behavior online. Let me make that clear. But you have to be more professional than they're being right now. It's very sad.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking with Peter Menzies from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about the Online News Act. Now, Peter, you recently published a paper with MLI about the need for the government to develop what you call a comprehensive media strategy. So maybe you could just give us the highlights. What does the government need to focus on in terms of ensuring a healthy media sector in Canada?
Well, it needs to understand that there's been a great disruption due to the internet. Like it's blown up the newspaper industry essentially, and all good things must pass. I guess this is just what happens. We had a great livery stable and hay industry until somebody invented the automobile, right? I mean, this is just the story of history, and same with the printing press made a big impact when it was invented. Understand the extent of the challenge in front of it. In front of us in order to make sure that we get good information. We've been lurching from one thing to the other. The local journalism initiative was a $10 million a year for 5 years, and now it's $20 million a year, and it's going to be extended, right? That was a sort of temporary stopgap while newspapers adjusted. And then there was the labor tax credit, which is about $120 million a year for 5 years, and that's now been extended, right? So we're at and then there's the Online News Act that we've been talking about, and then there's funding for the CBC and uncertainty about what its mandate is. Cabinet was overruled the CRTC on that. So all of these things seem to be and then there's CRT itself. All of these things are taking place independent of a broader strategy. So it's kind of like, okay, if you're going to get into having certain policy structures, whether they're tax credits or other things for news industry, let's have that conversation, because right now we're at risk of making our news industry permanently dependent on government subsidy, which is only going to lead to lower public trust in media, which means they're going to need more subsidy, which is going to lead to lower public trust, et cetera, et cetera. It's not sensible, and it won't end well.
No, it certainly sounds like a potential downward spiral. I want to get to the CBC and its mandate in a minute, but I quickly wanted to touch on the CRTC. Is there a role for the CRTC in a media strategy, or do you think that as an entity, it's not fit for purpose here?
Well, I mean, I think the CRTC itself is outdated and outmoded and should be replaced by a Canadian Communications Commission of some kind that actually has policies based on the understanding that we live in a new technology age and the internet is everything, and access and affordability are the main focuses in terms of that. That said, the way things are presented right now, it has to be part of this conversation, because right now, for instance, it insists that every radio station have a news component to it. And that makes a lot of sense if you're talking about making sure that if you're going to give somebody a radio license in Yellowknife or Lac La Ronge or, Bagotville, that they serve the local community, that there's a public good that they are serving by doing that. In cities like Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal, where you've got 40 or 50 licensed radio stations, it makes no sense at all to make all of them do news, particularly when most of them just have, basically have very small newsrooms and aren't able to do anything more than top line news for that. So they do have to be part of the conversation for sure, because they can't be doing things that are disrupting the good somebody's trying to do elsewhere.
Right, right. We've got about 45 seconds here just to talk about the CBC. In your view, what has gone wrong with the CBC, drifting beyond its mandate, and what should it be focusing on?
Well, it should be a public broadcaster, and it isn't. It's a publicly funded commercial broadcaster. It competes with the private sector in television for advertising, and it competes with the private sector as an online news product. It'll be the biggest single recipient of money through Bill C-18, and that's ridiculous. Having a good public broadcaster is, I think, a good idea, but having a publicly funded commercial broadcaster that occasionally pretends to be a public broadcaster and actually is sometimes on radio it's just crazy. Like, that makes no sense at all, and we need to really fix that.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much, Peter, for sharing your expertise with us on this very important issue.